Righto, vintage cards and why they're going to return with a vengeance. So if you haven't been kept up to date with the news, vintage cards have had like a serious plummet, right? They've actually fallen down quite drastically. And there's a few reasons why this has happened, right? There's a lot of issues with people that weren't that involved in TCGs and they wanted to relive their childhood experiences. So they were just buying these junk slabs, literally PSA 4s and 5s and 6s of these like, first edition vintage cards, which they weren't really caring about the quality or caring about the aesthetic of the card. They just wanted to own the card, right? And now the collector is completely different. If you ask a modern collector if they would buy a PSA 5, even of a top chase card, the buyer pool becomes very, very limited. But what actually happened during the 2020 and the 2021 boom, people didn't care. People were just buying literally cards that were creased, damaged, whitening, whatever. They just wanted to own the card in their collection. And that's what kind of caused this crazy spike, along with also COVID and people had more money on their hands and a lot of other things that happened during this time, right? And also to add some insult to injury, don't forget that during that time as well, PSA, CGC, Beckett grading service, these companies had wait times for over a year and a half. So what was in the market was just being traded because people were sending their cards to get graded, and they were literally, there's cases of people waiting 2 years to get their cards back from people who, sent their cards in mid 2020 and they got them back, late 2021 to even in 2022. And that there is cases out there of those kind of stories with PSA grading. And, even when I wanted to grade my cards in PSA, back in the day, I remember the wait times went from like 200 days down to 120 days, down to like 60 days. And now I look on their website, it's like 40 days for a turnaround, right? At the economy rate. So a lot has changed. There has been a lot of kind of shifts in the market, and vintage is kind of now stabilizing into an area where it's looking like a very interesting place. And it looks like it is a buyer's market, right? I'm going to be going through that today and talking about vintage cards and what's actually happened with them. Now, there is a few interesting things about vintage cards and the vintage phenomenon, right? Yes, vintage cards have tumbled down, but you could also make an argument that they're still above what they were selling before the COVID boom, that they're still very much above, those rates that they were. So there is a little bit of an argument for that, but there also is a pretty significant dip that's happened. And I wouldn't even call vintage a dip. I would say it is much more leaning into a crash, and I'm going to be taking you through that today. Also, guys, I wanted to say, if this is your first time tuning in, I'd love to say welcome to the channel. My name's Phil, and I am a marketing professional. I also run this Pokemon, investing, Pokemon collecting channel, and also do a lot of box breaks. So please feel free to subscribe. I'd honestly love to have you on board. It's been a pretty incredible journey on this YouTube. I kind of talk about life as well, and I kind of try having a real open discussion, with my audience, and I just want to be real with you guys. I've been consuming a lot of Pokemon content, before I made a channel, and I always felt like, it was either people screaming on their YouTube or, people just going over the top and always doing all these crazy things. And I just kind of felt like, hey, I'm a dad. I like collecting Pokemon, but I also don't feel like I'm part of a lot of the content creators. I feel like, hey, is there an audience for people that just like collecting cards and, playing video games at night? And then I was like, hey, I'm making this channel because, and I've kind of made a little bit of an audience with people that kind of feel the same way. So if it is your first time, welcome aboard. But here I am, and I'm going to be taking you through this, guys. So here I am on PSA's website, right? Now, this is the auction prices realized of PSA slabs. It's a pretty cool way to kind of get data of actual sales of cards, because what's going on when you go on TCG Player, you kind of have to filter. You never know what you're looking at. You have to either filter, especially with vintage, right? You got to go through heavy played. Is it light played? Is it damaged? Is it near mint? And then you've also got the kind of issue that who is, someone's near mint on TCG Player because you don't have photos of the cards. It's very different to someone else's near mint, So there's a lot of kind of barriers when you go on TCG Player and look at vintage. I much prefer to look at slabbed cards for vintage. And also a little bit of a pro tip, if you are buying vintage cards, either buy at events or card stores or shows and stuff where you can actually inspect the card yourself, or buy slab. I personally only buy slabbed vintage cards. I never buy raw. The reason for that is because I just know that, hey, when I buy the slab, I've got the quality that's been assessed. They've been passed through way too many hands of vintage cards, man. They've just been past the parcel. They've been creased, they've been stored in binders, they've been widening, they've lost their color. A lot of them are lowering their color temperature of the cards, they're faded. So, you got to be very careful when buying vintage. It's much more difficult than modern. But here I am, and I am on the Alakazam first edition PSA 9. Now, I want to take you through this. Now, it might be a little bit hard to see, and I'm going to put the prices there for you guys. So you can see here in 2018, it was selling for $412. So still a pretty expensive card. That's US, right? $412, and it was selling for around that $500, $400, $480 mark all through 2019. And you can see that that was actually holding for a significant portion. It was always around that price range. Then you can see when the COVID boom happened, which was, mid 2020. And you can see this went from a $400 or a $500 card all the way, and it started climbing to a $1,900 card. And this was during 15th of May, 2020. And you can see during this boom, look at what the PSA 9 first edition Alakazam sold by the end of 2020. $9,999 for a PSA 9 copy of a first edition Alakazam. It's wild, man. That is so expensive, And that was a bit of a, I think that was a bit of a freak accident. Kind of went back down, crashed a fair bit, and then it was sitting at this 2.9K, and it was actually holding this 2.9 to 2.5K range during 2021. And you can kind of see now where we're going, and I'm going to just take you now to 2024, and you can see now it's consistently selling for around 1.8K. So definitely above its original price, where it was selling before the COVID boom for around $500. Alakazam is selling for around 1.8K. But you can see if you bought or if you sold this card in around 2021, you would have been getting around the 3K mark, and now you're getting the 1.5K mark. So it's almost halved in value. Pretty significant drop. That is a big price difference. And now we are on the Blastoise first edition PSA 10 copy. Check this out, guys. All throughout, you can see the sales. They were very expensive even before COVID boom. So don't think that these cards were just, worthless before the boom happened. They were still selling for $4,000, $5,000 before the boom. And they held that price for a very long time. You can see the Blastoise in PSA 10 held, for nearly three years. It was holding at that, 5K, 6K mark. And then again, the boom happened, and you can see the sale price went to 7.5K, all the way to $20,000, and it hit a peak of an $80,000 sale during the boom, which is just, wild, man. What an expensive card. Anyway, then it kind of dipped down, and it was selling for around a 27K card, and then it was selling for around 44K, and you can now see the most recent sales around 23,000 to 23K US. Now, yes, it is still much more above the original $4,000 to $5,000 price that it was, but now it's sitting at that 23,000 mark. But you can see now why I think vintage cards are in a weird position. They have gone down, and I think they're not going to rise in the immediate term, but I think what's going to happen, guys, and we're going to see it in the near future, okay, is they're going to hold these prices. They're going to go down. But guys, you have to remember, when you're looking at these vintage cards like this Blastoise or anything like this, these are the first run of Pokemon cards in their original form, right? So when you look at Marvel Comics, what are the most established Marvel Comics? Everyone knows the biggest collections are the first ones that came out, you know what I mean? So these are very reminiscent of that time as well. These are yes, you had those 1996 Pokemon cards that came before it, but they weren't really the official cards that came out in the sense of, worldly status. These, the Blastoise, the Ninetales, the Alakazam, Neo Genesis, Neo Revelation, these were, that first era of Pokemon cards. So when you look at Pokemon in 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, these are always going to be, stuck in that time period as the first releases of the cards. So they are in a position to rise. We're going to keep going. You can see on the next one that we're here, the Charizard first edition PSA 8. PSA 8 was selling for around $4,000 pretty consecutively. A lot of sales. 2.8K, 2.8K, 2.9K, very, very consistent. You can see that graph. There was a very stable market with them. They were still very expensive, right? It wasn't a cheap card whatsoever. But you can see during the boom, shot up to 8.2K. Then it went all the way to a $28,000 card, a $30,000 card. It was making a few sales around there, $28,000 here. And then it was selling for 21K in 2021. And you can now see it went down, and it's kind of now sitting at that $10,000 to $9,500 mark. Definitely above what it was originally selling for, but that's a significant drop in price. It couldn't maintain that high value, though as you can see, we're having another marketing stabilization here. What usually happens is when the market sits for a stable point for a very long time, especially for things that are this sought after, they're going to hold stable. But just like you can see the graph here before where there was such strong stability, there will come a time again where they're going to either have to go down or up. And I do have an intuition and just a bit of a feeling that vintage cards will start skyrocketing up just because, like I mentioned before, they were the first print of cards. They have that real nostalgia factor, right? The Gyarados first edition PSA 9. Sitting here, in 2017, $600, $420, $459, and you can then see during the boom it was selling for $6,500. That's a PSA 9 first edition, right? And then you can see now, you can see this significant, that's a crash, right? When you're looking at that from where it was sitting, there was a lot of sales during this time too. You can see there was a few sales here, and now it's like sitting at around a $960 card, and you can see that they're actually selling for around $1,000 card in USD at the moment. Pretty big drops here, right? And this one is actually weird because before the boom it was selling for, $500. It's still double above that, right? But it would be hard to even look at that if you owned it before the boom, and then you can see that it's doubled when if you sold it at the top of the boom, you could have sold for, 6.5 or 5.5K, right? So that's a big difference, right? But still, like I can say, it's holding and it's got this stable position. The market's found some stability. I highly doubt that the market's just gonna stay stable forever, right? It's going to have a little bit of a nexus point. Will it go down or will it shoot up? Moving on to the Shining Gyarados, the PSA 9 from Neo Revelation. This is a PSA 9 copy. You can see it was selling for $210, $231, $242. Very stable. There was a very stable chunk of a timeline where, it was just selling consistently for around $220 to $250. When the boom happened, you can see, bam, look at that, 2.8K. Now you can see this one's had quite strong stability around 1.5K, and now it's selling for consistently around 1.2, 1.3, 1.5K. Still above of what it was selling above the COVID boom, but you can see this one's also not really finding that stability in the market like, the older vintage cards, but still it's getting there as well, and I think this is going to be a very interesting time for the vintage market. Moving on again, we got the Suicune PSA 9 first edition from Neo Revelation. Check this one out, man. This one's also been pretty crazy. This was selling for like $100, right? So like you can see this whole chunk here, that's all like $100 to, $90. And that was pretty stable. Then you can see when the boom happened, it sold for, a high of $3,100. Just ridiculous. I mean, that's just crazy. I mean, I do see kind of similarities with what's happening with alt arts at the moment as well. I know a lot of people get upset when I say that, but when they hit these prices, there's just so much hype around it. There's just so much circulation. You really got to know how to disassociate with that. Especially with modern cards, the pop reports are way more than these. If I pulled the pop reports of this Suicune or the Charizard, they are so small, man. Compared to what the cards are today, like when you got an Umbreon of 12,000 or a Blaziken of whatever it is, 3,000, 4,000, these have far less pop reports, right? And you're going down here, now you can see the card is selling for around $690, $635. Massive price difference. And even though that sale may have been a bit of an anomaly, you can still see it was selling for around $900 before that. So still quite a big dip from 900 to 600. Moving forward, we have the Crobat Holo PSA 9. Now you can see this one had a very interesting, this was selling for a $30 card, $18, $28. This is all before the boom. You can see in the boom, this was selling for $250, $234, and it hit a high of $264 in 2021. And you can see now this has found a new kind of established point in the market, and it's selling for around $58, $71. That is a significant crash, right? I would not call that a dip in any way, shape, or form. That is crashing. That has just, gone down. Right now, the most recent sale price was $58, and before the boom, it was selling for $40. So, massive, to make $18 or whatever it was there, $18 in what, 4 years? Bad investment, right? I mean, well, if you didn't sell at the top. And that's why you got to be careful, even with today's cards. You got to know when the top is, you got to know when the bottom is as well. Moving forward on the Poliwrath PSA 10, check out this market stability, guys. That is all selling for 1.4, 1.2, 1.3, 1.3. And you can see it's had that real stable chunk. And then the boom happened and one sold for $30,000. Just ridiculous. And the next sale after that was 13.7. And you can see now it's found a new established point at around 5.4K. I think it can go either way, though I think it's going to be a long time before these rise, but there will come a point, and I do think, whether it's 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when vintage cards decide to boom again, I really think they're going to come with a vengeance. Moving on to the next one, you can see the Ninetales PSA 9 first edition. Check this one out. Also finding a bit of it. This one's an interesting one, right? So you can see here, selling for around 350, 405, 405, 371. This was all before the boom. A big chunk of a stable market. You can see then when this started rising, it was selling for $875. And then bam, in 2020, it was selling for 2.25K. And then it hit a high at the end of 2020 for $4,300. Crazy price. And you can see now it found a new stability around here. It's finding a bit of a stable point at around $991, but you can see the 2024 sales have actually gone up a fair bit, and it's sitting now at a 1.6K was the last sale price of this Ninetales in PSA 9. So you can see interesting things can happen. They might boom, they might not, but it's looking like a very interesting point in the market. Moving on to another one, which is the PSA 10 Raichu. I find this one really interesting because this one is also a good example of what can happen, how big crashes can be. This is a first edition Raichu, mind you. This was selling around before the boom for around that, still selling for around 2K, right? Here you go, you can see there was a sale for $4,000, $2,100, $2,700. Then during the boom, it was selling for $25,000 and it hit a market high of $34,000. And you can see now the price has gone down quite significantly, and the most recent sale was $4,600. And that was not that different from a $2,700 card before the boom when you really look at it in terms of the growth that it had from a $30K card down to a $4,500 card. This is where vintage cards are going to be very interesting, though I would not count them out. And this is where I think a lot of people may be making a mistake. A lot of people may be thinking the vintage craze is over. Oh yeah, sell your vintage. Yeah, it's all about modern. Like everything, the tide always shifts. It's just like a pendulum, guys. It swings one way, it swings the other. Right now, it is in the buyer's favor. Right now, vintage cards are in the buyer's favor. If you want to buy vintage cards right now, you have options. You have far more leverage right now. Though believe me, there will come a point, it might be in 5 years, in 10 years, maybe the 30th anniversary, maybe it'll be a bit longer than that, we don't know, but the pendulum will swing because these are the first ever cards of Pokemon that made a worldly status. And that is incredibly important to know. If you are buying vintage cards, you need to be aware of this. Though, like always, there is always risks with buying Pokemon cards, and I always talk about Pokemon investing. Though, if you do want to know the 4 most important tips when it comes to Pokemon investing, you can watch that in this video right here. Within this video, I go over Pokemon investing as a whole, and I discuss the 4 most important Pokemon investing pro tips. If you love this kind of content, then I'm sure you'll like that video. Click that video that's appearing on screen, and I'll see you there.